we'll now move on to the item 8, urban design review of medium and high density housing in Christchurch. I'll just ask staff to come to the table to present this item. Thank you, David. I'll just get you to give an overview of the report.
Sure. As you would have heard, this is a report which is reviewing the current district plan rules as they pertain to medium density and high density in Christchurch and the urban design outcomes that have been achieved. I'll let David sort of speak to some of the key findings. Is that David? Yeah.
So the report is an urban design report into the quality of housing that's been built under the most recent district plan. We took a sample of 46 developments in 4 different zones where multi-unit housing is permitted. Overall, the findings were that most of the housing reached a basic standard of urban design, but there were a group of around a quarter to a third of sites that didn't reach this level. There were also some sites that reached a higher level. A basic standard means that the development is satisfactory in most respects or has some areas of particularly good performance, some areas of poor performance that balance out as a whole. The particular issues we found, there were some issues that were quite consistently found to be unsatisfactory across the sample. And these included that the street interface was not always high quality, and issues often related to that to do with site layout. And the site layout issues arising were often that there was outdoor living space at the street front, which led to areas being fenced. There was insufficient space allocated for amenity issues such as planting. There were sometimes privacy conflicts with large windows looking out onto the street where people could see into the private areas of the house easily, or windows looking into each other. There are also issues to do with crime prevention through environmental design. And it's not that we think that the developments are dangerous as such, but they're not following best practice in creating high quality environments that lend themselves to age well. In areas where there wasn't much medium density built so far, so new medium density areas, there were transition issues because the new development, because it's of a larger scale, looks a little bit out of place. In the central city, there was similar issues, but really there, because of the generally greater scale of development, these were probably more related to the design of the developments rather than the scale of them. There was different performance in the different district plan zones. The rules within the zones are quite different. We found that the best results were in the residential medium density zone. There was a more consistent level of performance there, and the least good results were in the residential suburban density transition zone a little bit further out, and potentially this is related to the level of management of those zones in the district plan. We compared the results to a similar survey that we did in 2009, and we found that in the inner suburbs there's been a significant improvement in design since then. The same isn't really true in the central city. There was a higher standard of design in 2009, and it's potentially that's related to what's happened since the earthquake, the change in the building conditions and the market conditions. And that's a quick summary of our findings.
Aaron?
Yeah, so just a couple of questions relating to some of the points raised during the deputations. Firstly, Mr Stokes points about the breaches that he clearly claimed that are in the rules that are not being adhered to, so if we can get an answer to that. And then in your survey, there was another claim made by an earlier deputation that why are these being rubber stamped when it comes through in the design, you can see it there, but then we find it in a survey later on. How did it get to that point? It's kind of what the public are wanting to know.
So I think, as sort of David alluded to, there is rules in district plan. People are entitled to apply for a consent to breach those rules, and those rules will that application will be assessed, so all these applications that have required a resource consent have been assessed, and in some cases the effects have been deemed to be no more than minor, so that's why they would have got consent. In some other cases, as David pointed out, there were some areas that were breaches, and there were some other positive aspects of it, and sort of on balance it was deemed satisfactory. There's also, I think, and it was alluded to in one of the deputations, and there is, the district plan sets objectives and policies about what we want to see in these areas, and I think this report highlights that maybe the rules, which are more set at a more minimum level, maybe aren't set at the right level to achieve the aspirations that we want. And so this report is highlighting that actually we maybe need to raise some of the rules. We also need to ensure that this is not just a regulatory response. There is also good education and good working with developers, and everyone needs to lift their game to achieve better design of these areas. And so we'll be using this to look at our district plan rules, but also working with the development community and on how we can improve things.
Just a follow on to that, if I can, Mr. Chair. So, but then if those rules come in, like with Mr. Stokes' point, they'll still be allowed to apply to breach them, so you don't get the outcomes you want.
So I think that one thing that we did note is that there has been an improvement since the 2009 survey. And what happened after that survey is that some new rules were brought in 2011. And that we expect has led to an increase in standards in the Living 3 zone and subsequently the residential medium density zone. So we think that demonstrates that the right rule sets can bring about an increase, and what we've done is to identify some areas where an improvement in standards is possible and related to the rules that are in place.
Thank you. Melanie?
I've got two questions. I think the first one's sort of similar to Aaron's actually. It's when you talked about them not meeting basic standards of urban design. So does that mean that that's been a breach, or that they have done something that wasn't originally understood by the planners or urban design staff when they went through the resource consent process?
So the applications, when they come in, are assessed under a set of restricted discretionary criteria, which were agreed under the independent hearings panel process. It's not necessarily that there's been a breach in the rules, but the ability to get a high quality outcome from the rules that are in place isn't always there, and it depends on the combination of the standards that are in place that agree basic matters like how much outdoor living space there should be and how much amenity space and amenity planting there should be, and the assessment matters. So the assessment matters are not potentially calibrated along with the rules quite right to get a high standard of design. So we reach a point where the development does enough good things that it has to be permitted under the plan.
And my second question is probably for both of you. Can you explain how the National Policy Statement on Urban Development is going to be affecting future developments, especially with relation to car parking density and heights of buildings, and then how important that will be that the urban design or district plan that we have will be in mitigating any effects?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's going to be a real challenge. We've got this new National Policy Statement on Urban Development that the government's put out. They require us to remove all car parking requirements except for disability parks. So that means we can no longer require anyone to provide a car park. When we change the rules, we've got 18 months to do that. It also requires us to review all the building height requirements and the density requirements. and it's asking us to really increase those in certain locations, so around centres and within walkable, so around shopping centres I should say, and within walkable catchments of those areas and around the central city. Now we're still working through and waiting for more guidance from central government as to exactly where those areas will be, and we're also working with our the other councils around Greater Christchurch and also the other major cities in New Zealand, because this applies to the 5 major cities in New Zealand, as to how these will be how these will work on the ground. We've got 2 years to change those rules, and we'll be doing that with public consultation with the community and doing a lot of work with the community on that. Now, that is probably going to lead to even more density in parts of the city. So that's going to mean, the design of that is going to be absolutely paramount to ensure that the more density, the higher heights doesn't detract from the quality. So yes, I know some people have suggested that the amount of density we're seeing at the moment is too much. The government are wanting to see even more density. So that's the direction that they've given us in terms of trying to have a compact city and rather than having sprawl and more carbon emissions and that kind of thing. So that's going to be a real challenge, how we achieve that and good quality. But we're up to the challenge, and this report puts us in a good place saying there are areas where we can improve. And we'll
Thank you.
Yep.
Jake.
David's. Hey, so I'm still, I thought I was clear after Aaron's question, but then after Melanie's I've become less clear. Are you saying that that where developments haven't been ideal, it's because they are at the poorer end of an allowed scale, or they're just simply outside what's allowed? And then if it's the latter, is it correct is it a fair interpretation to say that your team have signed things off as having a less than minor impact that in fact hasn't had a less than minor impact?
So the developments are assessed as whether they meet the standard expected in the district plan. The assessment takes place against the assessment matters in the plan rather than the policy. So there's a set of criteria that we have to look at, which is quite a limited set of criteria. The developments that are signed off are assessed as reaching those overall.
Right.
So they can have, sometimes there are some matters where it's clear that it's not as good as it could be, but it's compensated for by good performance in other areas. And that's a kind of, I believe that's how the plan is intended to work, that it's an overall performance. There is clearly a case where some developments are better than others, and they can reach a point where overall the balance of performance is considered to be appropriate, and those are ones that reach that basic standard, and that's probably what the plan is currently calibrated to allow for.
2 more. So 21 months, comment was made about that. How come it's taken so long? How will improvements be made, and how, will there be KPIs around how this works?
Yep. So yes, we did start this work 21 months ago, and we have come back and had a number of discussions on this report during that time. And one of the biggest issues we had is we didn't have a big enough sample size really to make conclusions, and that was because the rules came in place in 2017. So by 2018, we had some developments, but not really enough to be able to say this is a trend. We've now got more developments that has. So we can now see what the trend is. We've also had the National Policy Statement on Urban Development being well signalled, and we knew that was coming, and we needed to make sure that that the review was not inconsistent with that. So that only came out in July. So there are a number of reasons why this has only come to you now, and we've brought it really as soon as we practically could.
Thank you. And finally, Greg's idea of greater protection for trees across the city. Is that something we could look at as part of our work on the district plan?
There are protected trees in the district plan, and that was part of the review that went through the independent hearings panel. We'd have to have sufficient evidence that there needs to be more trees protected. There was actually quite a number of trees that, for those who were involved during that process, that were actually removed from the list at that time, based on evidence. So it is an area where we need to make sure there's sufficient evidence to add more trees in, but we can if there is. Yeah.
Andrew.
Thank you. 3 questions, if I can. The first one's the simplest. Have the recommendations that Helen Broughton was proposing been handed around? I don't have those as yet. Can we get that handed around? Thank you. 2 further questions. So in terms of the matters of discretion that have been referred to, Colin Stokes has suggested in his deputation that the district plan isn't been adhered to and isn't been applied correctly. So is it possible, or is it the case, that the district plan as it's written, or interpretation of the district plan as it's written, could actually address and avoid the issues that have been raised without the need for change, as was suggested by Colin Stokes, or is that not the case?
The report discusses this. There are a few confined matters where we believe that some changes in interpretation could bring about some improvements, but generally it's not a systematic problem that if we want to improve standards, then some changes in these matters are needed.
So it requires a plan change to achieve significant improvement?
Yes.
Thank you. And my final question, so referring to the deputation from Greg Partridge, the point's made that while this conversation's been going on for 21 months, and we've heard some of the reasons for that, development with some of the poor urban design outcomes, some of the issues raised continues. Is there anything that can be done in the meantime, realising the next piece of work is going to take some time? Is there anything that can be done to achieve improvement on a temporary basis, pending the outcome of the further work that's referred to in the report and the resolutions today? Or do things just have to continue the way they are in the meantime?
Development applications are subject to the process that we go through, and there's checks and balances with the possibility of appeal to court. So we assess applications in the way that we believe that they need to be assessed in terms of the legal process. There are, as I said, some areas of improvement which include crime prevention through environmental design and the amount of landscaping that we can achieve, where we think there could be some improvements we achieve with the current plan. So that's something that we can ensure that we carry out. But those more significant improvements, I don't think there's much we can do ahead of a plan change.
So it's really just the interpretation of the current rules. There's nothing that can be done to, on a temporary basis, address matters while this is being considered in an environment where we may expect that change will result once processes have been completed?
I think the fact that this report is now public, people are aware now of the issues and the areas where there can be improvement. I think that might help. Not just when applications are assessed, but also for the development community to see these are the areas that could be improved. A plan change does take time. There is quite a rigorous process through the RMA with public consultation. So that's not a quick fix, but we can ensure through education and through the fact that this is public now and discussions with developers and with the community that these things are considered in applications that are being assessed right now. Yeah.
Thank you.
David Falconer, can I just perhaps assist Andrew in his question? The use of a practice note as a mechanism to provide some guidance around the interpretation issues, while Andrew's correct that the rule changes and the district plan policies themselves take some time to change. Do you want to provide some comment on the use of a practice note to guide the interpretation issues?
Yeah, so we can work with our consents unit, so that it's who are the ones who assess these applications. to see if they can develop some practice notes in line with the report's findings to ensure that when they process contents they interpret these things in line with what this has found.
Would it be helpful to add something to the resolutions that
We'll draft
addresses that?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Tim.
Thank you. I think sometimes when we're talking about these types of things, it's good to define what they are, like a practice note, how that works and what that is to the general public, because this actually affects our residents and ratepayers. So when we get into the jargon, it's actually really good if we can define that. I guess for me, if we're looking at, say, a national policy statement which is written in Wellington by central government, which is based on, say, an Auckland-centric plan, and how that affects Christchurch, and what traps us into the rules and what we can and can't adjust on. Could you just give a really quick outline on that, because I think that's really important.
Yep. So just your first point. So a practice note is a note for the council planning staff or consenting staff to be aware of in terms of this is how. Some guidance as to how to interpret these rules. So that's something we can work on. In terms of the national policy statement, so there isn't a lot of room for variation at a Christchurch level. The rules have been set by central government. The main rules around density apply to the 5 big cities of Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, Wellington and Christchurch. And they set out that they want to see height limits increased and densities increased around those shopping centres and around public transport in the central city. There is some matters that we can take into account to amend some of those building heights. One's around heritage. There's some elements around hazards, and there's a list of them, but they're quite site specific. We can't have a blanket rule that says, we want to protect all of Christchurch. We want to protect, not have building heights. It's going to have to be very, very site by site. So we do have a very limited ability to move away from the national direction. Unfortunately, it's statutory mandated by the Resource Management Act.
Thank you very much for that, because I guess when we go out to consult, it's very important that people know that our district plan is trapped within a national policy statement, and there's only so much we can go outside that. So it's technically we can only set so much as a city, which seems ridiculous, but we won't go. I guess when you've got your sample of 45 and a third of them aren't reaching the basic design standards, that's an issue. So to answer that, there is a problem there. So do we need to lift our rules? Because I know that people come and they ask for a variant, and if it's within a certain amount, generally if it's going to a hearing panel, the commissioner technically will, on a technical basis, allow those. So there's a lot of moving and shaking. So do we need to lift the bar to ensure that moving and shaking is then lifted as well?
I think if we want to achieve that higher standard, then we would need to make some changes that would be aimed at doing that. And we've identified some particular areas of where improvements could be made, and that hopefully would lift the overall standard.
And with consultation, obviously we'll hear from the residents and the ratepayers that these are areas that they are concerned of as well. So we'll be looking at those.
Yes. Yep.
Great. And finally, I guess with councillors and our relationship and a committee's relationship with staff, those practice notes, what would be the best way forward to get a good understanding of that relationship of us reflecting our ratepayers' concerns and giving direction to staff? Because I know that it's really hard for you guys when you've got variants, etc., and you're going in front of panels and commissioners. So what do you think would be good to give us with regards to practice notes?
Within the current environment, if we assess an application, we have to assess it in line with the district plan.
Yep. So
in terms of what could be looked at a hearing, it would only be what's in the plan, and the practice notes would have to relate to the assessment matters we have.
So that would go back to through the consultation. If we lift the level for restricted discretionary criteria, then that would then reflect the practice notes, etc.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Cheers.
James Daniels.
Te mea tuatahi, kia ora to all the people who made deputations, and kia kōrua tēnā koe, tēnā kōrua. Look, apologies, I missed part of Councillor Scandrett's questions and your answers, so I may be repeating him. Nevertheless, people who are tuning in on this online will be maybe baffled by some of the jargon, some of the acronyms and initialisms, but I think that they will be a bit alarmed about some of the deputations that have been made, and I'll get to one of those in a moment. I've got two questions. David, you said that things are not as good as they could be, but they're better in some areas, and overall it's good enough at one stage. So I find that a bit alarming, that good enough is good enough. I don't think good enough is good enough. But you also note that you can see an improvement between 2009 and now, which is good. So in recognising the fact that council includes us, all right? So when I'm going to mention council in a moment, I mean us as well. So my question is, you said everybody needs to lift their games. Does that include council?
So addressing the point about the good enough, the report assessed developments on a 5-point scale, and we used the term basic satisfactory to mean meeting a basic standard of design. And when I talk about basic or satisfactory, that's what I mean, that it meets a basic standard of design, but it's not what you'd call high quality. So it's not a value judgment, it's just a sort of a technical grading that it's satisfactory rather than good or poor.
But those were the words that were used. But
yes, I'm just clarifying what I intended to by those.
Okay. So the question is, you said that everybody needs to lift their games. Does that include council?
Yeah, I mean, I think this report highlights that there is room for improvement, and we've acknowledged that, and so this gives us a real good evidence base to be able to make those changes to our district plan. Yeah. So yes, we can make improvements.
Thanks. Yeah. Right, then one of the deputations from Colin Stokes mentioned, and he was quite eloquent about it, and he repeated it a number of times, about the breaches of standards. What happens to those people who breach standards?
Sorry.
Yeah. So, when we say there's a breach, so people are entitled under the Resource Management Act to apply for consent to breach the rules. So it's not a situation where breaches are not allowed. It's that breaches must be assessed, and they must be considered, often by a panel, and then a decision is made whether that breach will be allowed or not. So that is a right that people have under the Resource Management Act, and so a lot of these consents have done that, and so that's why they have been allowed.
And just to follow up, the best developments are often not developments that comply with all the rules. They're developments that have a good design, and sometimes that involves breaking some rules in order to get a good overall quality of development. So to restrict ourselves to the idea that we must comply with the rules doesn't necessarily result in the best outcomes. That's why we have a discretionary application process, so that we can look at the overall outcome.
Yeah, and once again, I'll go back to what I started with, which is that Joe citizen, guy or girl, watching this wouldn't necessarily understand the technicalities of it and the nuances of it, because it sounds like things are going things are going pakaru, you know, that they're broken. So it's really important that we put this into context, because then people understand far better than the way we do now. Okay, but thanks for the report.
Thank you, Leanne.
Just trying to understand the national policy statement on urban development that was gazetted on the 23rd of July. Will that prevent us from introducing maximums into the district plan? Because at the moment we have a net density requirement of at least 50 households per hectare for intensification development in the central city, and at least 30 households per hectare for intensification development in the medium density residential development zones. And my issue, and I know a number of issues have been raised by residents about the lack of maximums written into those two provisions, but most particularly the residential medium density zone.
The maximum is 65 per hectare.
Sorry?
The 65 per hectare.
I'm sorry, I'm asking staff the question about these are minimums. We want to write in a maximum for if we wanted to write in a maximum for the residential medium density zone. Does anything in the MPS prevent us from doing so?
So the MPS requires around what they call metropolitan centres, which is essentially our large shopping centres, that there is we enable building heights at least up to 6 stories high, and density that goes along with that, and also within a walkable catchment of those centres. Now, a lot of those...
I couldn't find a density, though, a household per hectare. So I'm assuming that the only mechanism that is being provided for in the MPS to address this issue is height, which means that we don't have to... For those that are built as townhouses, we can actually write in a maximum.
Well, so you're right. There's no. There was in the draft. There was talk about a maximum, a level of density.
I know, which is why I'm asking the question.
In the final, there's only that requirement about height, but we need to ensure that we enable that height. So if we set a maximum which prevents people from ever getting that high, that's in breach of the national policy statement. So,
but what if we were to make a difference between the height and the so an apartment building, for example? I mean, we don't actually know yet because we haven't had the guidance from, as I understand it from what you've already advised us, that you're waiting for guidance on where those specific zones will be, because it isn't clear in the MPS exactly which areas of Christchurch, for example, will be covered by their definition of the the areas that they've described in the MPS. I'm sorry, I haven't got it open.
Yeah.
So given that we don't know that yet, when we do know that, are we able to differentiate between the two?
Yes, yeah. We are still waiting for more guidance and from more analysis as to how this will apply to Christchurch. So we don't know exactly what implications this will have yet. But we do know that the MPS is very much about increasing density, increasing heights, getting more people living closer to centres, closer to public transport for a whole raft of benefits. So it will be quite limiting, quite difficult for us to put in caps on that detract from the whole policy of trying to bring people closer to these areas. So we will look at that, and we will get guidance from central government and from the other councils as to how to apply this. But I suppose I'm just saying it's going to be a challenge, because the whole ethos around the national policy statement is to get more and more people living closer to public transport, closer to these centres for a whole raft of good reasons. So putting a cap on that is
not a single resident that I've spoken to is opposed to intensification. They're opposed to over intensification.
Yes.
So
yeah.
I'm just, there's two other things, because we've heard people mention the enhanced development mechanism. Can you advise or can you confirm that this was inserted into the district plan by the land use recovery plan and that it has never ever been used by a developer?
Yeah, so yeah, the enhanced development mechanism, which is the 65 maximum, which has been quoted this morning, that was introduced to the previous city plan back in, I think it was about 2013, by the land use recovery plan by Sarah at the time. That was to enable enhanced development of what was the rules back then, which didn't enable as much development as the government was wanting. Those rules are still in the plan because they are under a recovery plan that does not expire until June next year. But in the meantime, we did a district plan review, and the independent hearings panel that was set up by the government reviewed all the rules and have actually enabled, in some cases, more density, especially in the suburban density transition zone. And they did not set a maximum in those areas. So the enhanced development mechanisms are an option for people to use, that if they use it, that they are constrained by that maximum. Now, from what I understand from our consents department, in the last 5 or 6 years, no one has used those because of they're constrained by the maximum. And if they choose not to use them, they're not constrained by the maximum. And so there is no maximum that we.
That was the decision of the commissioner in the Merivale Lane case.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yanni.
Yanni used to be that young person.
Thanks, Jake. So I just had several questions. I was just interested if Christchurch has signed up to the urban growth area. I know Auckland has. And I was just wondering if council, through that process, can discuss with central government the outcomes that they're trying to seek around urban development. Because what seems clear from what we've heard is there's a whole bunch of stuff happening at a central government level that we have no say or influence in, but then there's another process underway where we're currently joining in partnership, which possibly could give us the ability to have much more specific conversations. So does anyone know where that urban development growth agenda agreement has got to and when it's coming back to council?
I could probably answer that one, Yanni. So I think you're talking about an urban growth partnership under the government's, what they call the urban growth agenda. Is that correct? So Christchurch and Greater Christchurch hasn't signed urban growth partnership with the government.
So would it not be advantageous for us to actually do that, given one of the pillars of that process is about quality built environments, defining clear, concise, unambiguous built environment principles at a variety of scales from the site and street level through to city level in terms of urban form, and it also includes a spatial planning component?
Yes, as you know, as part of the Greater Christchurch 2050 project, we are looking at one of the aspects of that being a follow-on with the urban growth partnership across Greater Christchurch with the government, but we've got a process to work through and it requires both the engagement of the Greater Christchurch partnership and also central government in that, and that's not a matter that we've covered or that the staff have covered or relates to the reports today.
It seems like there's different strands of stuff happening that's not aligned. If you go back to the urban development strategy, intensification, consolidation was one of the key principles on the basis that there was good urban design and, you know, good looking at how you get better environmental amenity for the areas that we're going to intensify. So I'm just sort of struggling to understand why we've got a separate process for that and a separate process for this.
Because they're separate processes. I can't articulate any better. This is a review that was commissioned by the Christchurch City Council, appropriately into how the urban design form was being applied across medium and high density, and the report back from staff addresses the original question of council, the question that you're raising about whether or not the council or the Greater Christchurch councils enter into an urban growth agenda / partnership with central government isn't related to the original question of undertaking a review of urban form for medium and high density.
Even though that's one of the urban development strategies, outcomes and actions. I mean, I think in terms of the recommendations under 2, we should actually note that there's an opportunity through that process. That would be my preference, so I'll just leave that with you. I just wanted to check, in terms of the history of this, we had our district plan start in 1995. In 1999, we introduced volunteer guidelines for L3 and L4, which in character areas, which pretty much failed. And then in 2007, we started on a plan change 53 to improve the urban design of L3 and L4, which then got brought in just before the earthquake. And then after the earthquake, we basically had the district plan review, which basically meant that we lost the standards that we'd put in place. Is that?
So, what I mean, the L3, L4 plan change that went through about 10 years ago, that is really what, as Dave alluded to before, has really driven this improvement in the medium density zones. So those rules were changed just after the previous report, which happened 10 years ago, was released, and so we improved the rules then, and we have seen in the last 10 years an improvement in the quality of that medium density zone. They were largely kept intact by the independent hearings panel. So we've seen an improvement there. What the independent hearings panel did is they also changed the suburban density transition zone, which that wasn't part of the L3, L4 plan change. And I think some of the things we've identified here actually is if some of the good work that was done through the L3, L4 plan change had been carried through to the density transition zone, then we may have seen some improvements as well, and that's something we're looking to do. The central city, where we haven't seen as much improvements, is completely separate again, because that had a recovery plan that was put in place by Sarah. So that has a different set of rules as well, and which was put in place by central government rather than by council. So there is different rules in different zones, and we're seeing different outcomes. And it actually is the L3, L4 plan change that seems to have seen the best results. So there's good work there.
And just in terms, just 2 more questions. One, in terms of our district plan, the strategic, what weight do we need to give to the strategic direction that was put in through the statement of expectation and the hearing panel around reducing the need for urban design and consents and community notification? Like, how much does that plan issue, and what the concerns that have been raised today are?
Well, that was in place when the panel obviously made their decisions, and so that did have a factor in on the reason why some of the rules are the way they are, and so you could say that has an implication of why we've got some of the issues we have now, and that objective is still in place, and we are looking at whether we can review that. We've still got recovery plans in place till next year, so we are still constrained to some extent as to how much we can change. But yes, we once we have sort of full control of our district plan, once those recovery plans are no longer in place, then yes, we'll be able to look at some of those rules again.
And just a final question. I mean, a number of the concerns that have been raised today are not just about, I guess, the district plan. It's how the district plan is administered. And I just wondered, as part of this review, what assessment have you done in the way in which we're administering the district plan, in terms of whether we're doing adequate assessments on the impacts on community, and whether we're actually notifying things to people that are impacted by them?
We can only notify according to the RMA where the plan allows, and for most residential development, we're specifically not allowed to notify. So that would be, in terms of when applications come in, we can't notify them. In terms of the report does look at how the results are performing in terms of the assessment matters. So it does look at whether we are achieving what we set out to achieve. It looks at whether the applications are in line with what should be expected from the assessment matters that we have, and it does conclude that there are some areas where potentially better results could have been achieved with the existing plan, but that generally that's not the case, and that some rule changes are needed if we want to improve standards.
I'm just trying to understand, like, take transport for example. I've just read like a Brockworth Place assessment, and it says things like, you know, there's a non-compliance with a visibility display, and it goes on to say neither the footpath nor the car park on site are likely to be particularly busy. Brockworth Place is a local road. Anyone that's been to Brockworth Place can see the problems with traffic getting in and out of the density intensive housing units that's been built there. So I was just trying to understand whether or not, say, for things like traffic assessment around the impacts of like the non-compliances, all the discretionary matters that we have a responsibility to look at, whether we're doing that adequately enough to mitigate the actual impacts that are happening, rather than, you know, some of the stuff that we read in the consenting thing. Have we actually looked at the consents in detail to see whether or not the assessment we're doing of the impacts are actually just less than minor? And do we have, any concern about the robustness of those types of assessments?
So the review isn't a reassessment of the application. It's a fresh look at the quality of the development when it's built against the policies and assessment matters. So we haven't looked at the assessment process and made an attempt to decide whether decisions were correct or not. We've simply looked at the quality of the development that we're getting, and is that the quality of development that we are expecting. We didn't look at the Brockworth Place example, so I'm not familiar with it. But it's also an urban design review, so it wouldn't necessarily consider traffic safety, because it's all important, but that has its own specialism. So we didn't engage a traffic person to look at the developments.
Can we start, Chair? Can we maybe just make note of the audit that's supposed to be happening? Because I think a number of the concerns that are being raised today are not just about the design standards, it's also about how we interpret and assess the designs that are being presented in front of us.
Yeah, we'll just go through the questions first and then look at the resolutions. Pauline?
Yes, yeah, actually, look, I follow on from that, and it's also from James, but my concern is when we did talk about the assessment criteria, and my interpretation of your answer was that you balance it out. So if an application has some really strong features, but maybe a couple of weaker ones that actually don't comply, it can still get a consent, and we just kind of suffer those ones, or there may be some mitigations, but generally we don't see those. And this is why we're actually ending up with developments that have maybe one glaring horrible feature that really upsets the community. So my question is there a way that when we're doing these assessments that we can consider each breach on its own rather than throwing it into a mix and averaging it out?
I think that an assessment could be done in such a way that if there's a major breach, then that may be enough for it to be declined. That may be the way an assessment can be made.
But that's not what we're seeing, is it? We're seeing developments that we wonder how they got consent for turning up in the community, because they've got a major breach. So my question is can we tinker around with the way we do the assessment of the multi-criteria assessment? I mean, is that restricting the decision making? Is it allowing these things to happen because of the criteria assessment?
Yeah, I think as we identified, I mean, there are some rules where we need to lift the bar, because the district plan sets a bar, and then people can apply for consent and they can put arguments that something's minor or not. So they can move it, slightly below the bar as well. So raising the bar makes it harder to have a bigger change. And I think there's also there is also a challenge here around we want good density, but we also want we want density. The district plan calls for more density, and I think that's been a real success over the last 10 years. We've actually seen a lot of density, and we're now seeing more development through intensification than we are through greenfield development. So we are seeing less sprawl. We're seeing a more compact city, which is what the urban development strategy wanted. So it's around finding that balance between having density but doing density well, and that's
I know.
And that's a real challenge. So some places we will have to raise the bar.
But it's what you're finding is you're finding the balance in amongst the assessment criteria, and it's the outcome of that is sometimes seeing one glaring breach being permitted. So that's where I'm coming from. Can we tweak that the way we assess it?
I think that's not something that necessarily the report finds, because it's a technical report that we can comment on. So I'm not sure that we can confirm that that's the case on the basis of the evidence that we provided.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. Finally, Anne.
Thank you. Just it's actually following on from what Pauline was asking, and thank you, David and David, for sitting there and answering some really difficult questions and for the way you've answered them in a clear way. Thank you. Appreciate it. Just in terms of, I'm wondering, with our design standards, our urban design standards, there's a 5-point scoring. Is there any way that going forward with our practice note that we can just say we're just going to go for best practice?
I think, our practice notes do have to be in line with our district plan. So if we want to go for best practice, if we want to see everything achieve, 4s or 5s, then we are going to have to lift the bar of the minimum rules. So I suppose that's what this report highlights, that there are areas where we do need to lift the game.
So, Brendan, is there any way that we can incorporate that into a practice note, that we are actually going to aim for that going forward from this point, addressing what Greg was saying about what happens in the meantime in terms of what's developments?
David's answer was no, you can't put in a practice note a higher standard than what the rules and policies and objectives are in the district plan, but the district plan can be the method of interpretation via the resource consent process. We can flush out through the practice note. So we've got a draft resolution that requests staff develop a practice note that articulates the expectations in the district plan for good quality urban design, which is what the objective of the district plan is. The difficulty is when it gets down to the exact nuts and bolts of it, that both Davids have articulated, that the plan as it is, in 2/3 of cases, leads to reasonable and good outcomes, but in some cases doesn't lead to good outcomes. And we've articulated a number of times that we can make an improvement in the plan about what those kind of rules are to lift the game, and that's the baseline, but we can and should do a practice note in the intervening period as well. Yep.
All right, thank you. So that's the end of questions. And I understand the Mayor wants to move.
Yes, I'd like to move the motion, but I'm just the second one, which is request staff report back to the committee as soon as possible on the implementation requirements of the MPS on urban development. I kind of like just some additional words that says something along the lines of, in order to inform an urgent piece of work, which is the consideration of a plan change to address maximum densities in the medium density residential development zone. Because I mean it's for a purpose that we need to get the briefing, but we were to consider this piece of work that's just being reported to us now. And I know that COVID-19 has stood in the way of progress in some of these things, plus the MPS coming out in the meantime. But the intention was that this piece of work that we're receiving today will inform the work that is being done on developing a proposed plan change for us to consider. It's urgent.
There's also, should be a note in version coming up too in regards to what. There's also another one coming up with regards to what Yanni was saying, so. Oh, they're not there yet. Yeah. So you happy to
a plan change of the residential, well, to introduce maximum densities for residential medium density zone. I'm just trying to
wonder,
think.
Leanne, if you use them, it might be useful here to refer to the more common vernacular of to prevent over-intensification.
Okay.
As opposed to
all right,
us getting caught on a
for,
technicality.
Look for an outcome, yeah. To prevent over-intensification.
So of a proposed plan change to prevent over-intensification.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Sorry, Aaron, you had a question.
And residential amenity, which will pick up the urban design issue.
And provide residential amenity. You're not trying to prevent that, I don't think. Is that what you said?
Melody, did you want to second that? Okay. Aaron, so you had one last question.
Yeah, just how did you want to deal with the proposed recommendations from Helen Broughton that was passed around? Did you get a copy of that, Mike? I mean, is the table happy to include them or not, Mr. Chair?
You are more than welcome to put them forward as an amendment.
I will put them forward as an amendment.
Okay.
Yeah, at this point, I'm happy to drop off any if anyone is opposed, and I'd like to hear their views as to why, and then if there's a good reason, drop them off, otherwise I...
On the first proposed recommendation, I explained yesterday that we do have a piece of work and we are simply waiting on the guidance from central government related to the guidelines around the national policy statement and what they mean, and that in fact covers the engagement that we do want to undertake with all of the residents association, not just the ones within the residential medium density zones, and we'll also hear from other residents associations today that fall outside of those zones, and so I think you probably want to take a broader view on that. I'm not sure it's necessary at this juncture. I think the report that you are shortly to receive has articulated well the concerns that both staff have observed and have independently verified, and that residents have brought to our attention. I thought we were getting to the stage of wanting to make progress on those now. And the second point about parking issues, I don't know whether that's general parking issues. We've got separate processes via the suburban and the central city parking policy for addressing parking issues, or if it's relating to the presence or absence of restrictions on minimum car parking requirements, that's dealt with in the national policy statement immediately. So David has articulated that that's an immediate effect, that there's no possibility of us having minimum car parking requirements with the exception of disability car parks.
Yeah, but the issues are there, so I mean, there's...
So Aaron, maybe the best way forward is actually to ask staff to write us a memo in relation to the recommendations put forward from
Okay,
Helen,
let's
so therefore we
request
can
that
actually...
for this point, and then we can address it at that once that comes back. Thank you.
So, Leon, are you happy for that to be another resolution, that staff write a memo in relation to Helen Broughton's recommendations? Okay. So while that's getting written up, we'll start the debate. Do you want to start and close? Yeah.
Oh.
Is that quick?
I've just sent round some additional recommendations, so I just want to make sure that you've got those. Just on Helen Broughton's amendments, number 4, we're going to get a memo on it, but we've actually already discussed that repeatedly around our development contributions policy. So I just wanted, actually we don't need a memo, we just need it done. And so can we just get like a clearer action on what the process is for that actually happening and done? So
sorry, I'm actually happy if actually how the current recommendation we have up there is sitting.
In terms of 5?
Yes. Yes.
Right, and then under 4, I was just wondering if we could put a date on it, given one of the frustrations has been the perceived lack of urgency. And, you know, number 4, I think, is already well overdue. So are we able to put a date on it, please?
I'd want to hear from staff with regards to their workloads, because, you know, we can set a date and we can set a date to fail, but what I think we need is actually the information and the right information, the right end game, but we need to talk with the staff with that.
Look, I think we don't need a date there. Tim's the chair of that committee and he'll follow it up to make sure it happens as soon as possible. Look, I'm actually happy with where the recommendations are. They have been moved in second, so I'm going to go into debate now. Leanne?
Sorry. What's set behind the issue that led to this report being requested by the council were the concerns of residents, not about intensification, but about over-intensification. People have been accused of being NIMBYs, but they're not. They're not the people that sit there and say, not in my backyard. They definitely don't say that. What they're concerned about is the amenity of their neighbourhoods, the places they choose to live. And this has happened right across the city, in the area in Riccarton that has been mentioned, which I did go for a walk through and watch the impact of going from a situation of people renting a townhouse to people renting a room, couples renting a room, and every time you replace one villa with 4 townhouses, and some of the ones that we're talking about today are not the 4 townhouses, but if you've got 4 bedrooms in each, then there's often 2 cars per bedroom, 8 cars per unit, times 4 is 32 the last time I looked. So that, and when you go down the streets that are like this, you actually see the impact of the car parking on berms, the car parking, you know, everywhere. So it's it does create a real damaging reality. And so I do agree with looking at the issue of how we resolve parking, because now we're going to have all parking requirements removed from our district plan. So there'll be no obligation for developers to provide parking parking. They're not prohibited from providing parking, so I'm hoping that many will. But we do, as a city, have to start thinking about how we're going to resolve what is going to be a transition from the dependency on motor vehicles that we have at the moment, hopefully to a more carbon neutral environment in the future, where the dependency is replaced by much more convenient ways of sharing transport options, and from a sustainable basis. The lockdown gave me a chance to do one thing that was really good, and that was to read a number of things, a number of the decisions that have been made by commissioners, and to get my head around the complexity of a district plan, which did go through a process where the government told us we had to reduce our requirements on resource consents, so that we had to make more things permissive under the plan, and we were also required by the government to reduce public notification. And even though the Maryvale Residents Association, I take my hat off to them, did make a very powerful set of submissions to the Commissioner in that particular case, and he did respond to the issues that were raised, it was not publicly notified. So I want people to know that, because it was not something that this council wanted to do to its district plan. It was imposed by the requirements of an order in council passed by the previous government. But what the district plan says in its objectives are high quality residential environments. High quality, sustainable residential neighbourhoods which are well designed, have a high level of amenity, enhance local character and reflect the Ngāi Tahu heritage of Ōtautahi. What the decisions tell me is that this objective does not matter when it comes to the rules. It's the rules that apply, and it's the rules of the district plan that we need to focus on as a council, and we do need to consider change. And this is important, and it is imperative, because more and more developments will occur. Now, what the report tells us, and I just want to say there is good news in this report. The good news that is in the report is that there are developers who do consider the local environment that they're in and build to that environment. You know, and there are some developers that have perhaps created a stir in a neighbourhood in one area, but actually they've built something really good in another area that is appropriate to the environment where they've built in. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach as far as developers I know, I live in an apartment building myself, and I know that residential amenity was very much at the forefront of that development. There is the issue for us is that our plan states a maximum density for the central city density zone, which has an average net density of at least 50 households per hectare, and the residential medium density zone has to achieve an average net density of at least 30 households per hectare for intensification. So those are the two requirements. There is no maximum density that's associated with either of those. It's the enhanced development mechanism that has the one. So we've got to get on with this.
Andrew.
Thank you. Clearly there are some matters of major concern which have been raised by the report and by the people that I thank for coming along to speak to the meeting today. And given the directions from the government of the day regarding intensification and the matters set out in the Order in Council, and more particularly in the Statement of Expectations, some of this probably shouldn't come as a surprise. And referring to that statement, it included reducing planning requirements, fewer rules, resource consent and notification of applications means less opportunity for the community to have their say, and what was described as facilitating a high quality recovery and rebuild, bracket, increased supply and intensification of housing, close bracket. And it's some of that which has brought about the situation that we're in today. Now, I hope we can find a way to address these as soon as possible through all means possible. Interpretation of the current rules and exercise of discretion, the practice note that's now referred to in today's resolutions, a plan change, a better understanding of the new NPS and how its application will affect the matters that we're talking about today, and how that can be interpreted to bring about the best results in the planning environment that the new NPS creates. I do have some concern about the parking and intensification matters that new NPS brings about, and I welcome the work which has been done on guidance and interpretation and the application of the NPS as soon as possible, so that we and our communities have got some certainty as to what might be allowed or even encouraged, and what the future look and feel of parts of the city might be. It does feel like the NPS, to some extent at least, is driven by an Auckland appropriate approach, which could bring about some suboptimal outcomes for parts of Christchurch, particularly given the unique situation that we're in as we continue to rebuild here after earthquakes. So I'm keen to get some improvements in the short term. I support the use of a practice note to inform the exercise of discretion and interpretation, and I'm thankful to staff for that suggestion today. There's been some clear sentiment expressed in the report and in this meeting, which I'd like to see influence the matters of discretion and consideration of applications where it can. And if a practice note's the way to achieve this, then I definitely support that approach. It's clear that the status quo is not working. It's clear that it's bringing about outcomes that are not supported by our communities and that are inconsistent with our vision and our aspirations for the city. It's bringing about poor outcomes for the people that are living in these developments, whether it's as owner-occupiers or as tenants, and in particular for neighbours who have in many cases lived in these neighbourhoods for a long time and who are affected by the type of developments that are now taking place. We need to do what we can. We need to do it as quickly as possible, and we need to use all of the tools that we've got in the toolbox to bring about improvement as soon as we possibly can.
It's good timing. Phil.
Yeah, I'm just following along from what James said. I'm concerned that what I call the good enough line, like we've got some things that have been put forward to us that are below the line, but it's okay because we've got a lot of stuff above it which sort of drags the average up. Anything that's below the good enough line, take it away and make it above the line, because it's otherwise people will design stuff to below the minimum if we let them get away with it, because it'll become the norm, not the exception. So we've just got to lift our game and have none of this below the line stuff. Thank you.
Pauline.
Thank you. Yeah, along the same lines there, I think that it's been a really good discussion today. I think we've actually clarified a lot of processes in the consenting process there, and a lot of perhaps substandard things, and particularly Leanne mentioned the rules, but I'm also focusing on the interpretation of the rules, and that's why I'm really pleased to see 3 and 4 there. It's the balancing out of these breaches that really concerns me, and you know, particularly when you've got a glaring breach and it's averaged out. So this is one reason that we're getting these developments that are enraging the communities, as we've heard today from these deputations, telling us about inferior, ill-fitting, medium-density housing in their communities. And a glaring example of this is the relocation of the temporary earthquake housing units in Richmond, and how this was permitted to happen under the rules, I don't know, because they arrived in a character area. And so obviously it was an interpretation of those rules. So I'd really like to see this assessment method revisited, so that each breach is assessed on its own rather than averaged out over the application as a whole. And I'd also just like to note that when the independent hearings panel was doing our current district plan, we were really pushing for pervious surfaces to be included, and we lost that battle with them. But I think we shouldn't give up on that, because pervious concrete is now available, and we need to be making sure that we can put that in the future in order to achieve our stormwater consents. So I'll be supporting this today. Thank you.
Jake.
Yeah, I'll just briefly say that I'm really pleased that Council's picking up the baton and running with this. Particularly as a first-term councillor, it's heartening to see that we're finally listening. It's just a shame that it's taken so long to get any action on this.
Yanni.
Thank you. Look, I think obviously the recommendations today are continuing to progress what's going on. But, you know, fundamentally, I think at the heart of this is the fact that we've got Auckland planning being imposed on Christchurch by central government. We've had things like a housing accord, we've had things like the ability to go into the urban growth partnership that we're not making the most of in terms of getting a bespoke outcome for Christchurch. We've had the most extraordinary powers imposed on us and enabled to us by central government in the last decade, and yet we still struggle to get basic planning and urban design controls put in place. It really needs to change, and it needs to change quickly for the better. The residents today have made a very compelling case about the long-term damage that happens in communities. The reality is that this has been going on since 1999, and while we got some improvements in 2011, most of those were quickly undone by the previous government and the district plan review in terms of the post-earthquake environment. So I just think we need to act with urgency. My preference would have been to use the Regeneration Act to actually get stuff done quicker, as it was done to us previously to remove controls. We should have been using that to put controls back in place, but obviously that time frame is now no longer an opportunity, which is a shame. I know in the previous report, or the next one we have to consider around Airbnb, that is an option that was given to us. So, you know, I just think we need to act with urgency. Clearly it's unacceptable to have poor urban design happening in our city. It has a massive impact on local communities who don't even get a say in what's being done that impacts on them. And we get a number of assessments which I think are questionable about the impact being less than minor when it has a major minor on the people that live in that neighbourhood. So we need to get on and fix this as soon as possible.
Thank you. Melanie?
I think that we have learnt a lot through the report and the discussions today. I think instead of looking backwards, we need to use that to look forwards. And we have, as a council, I think, have to take responsibility that those staff and also those that sit on hearings panels, of which I am one, or have been, you know, we need to use the rules, and we do have to have a little bit of, there has to be flexibility applied because there's the problem of legal challenges. So it is up to us as a council to write the district plan in a way that lifts the bar, as staff have said, so that when things go under for minor differences like 10 centimetres here or there, that it does bring about good outcomes. So really it's on us to do it and not to realise that what we have in our district plan is the most important thing, and that it's not necessarily the interpretation that's the problem.
Thank you. Sarah? Yep.
Yep.
Oh, sorry, we've got Sarah first then.
Oh, sorry. Yep. So we are at the start of a transition as a city. We've been sprawling and beautifully low density for a really long time, but we do need high density in the city over time so that we don't end up building on our versatile and productive soils as our city grows. And we do need to make sure that these developments have good outcomes for the communities that they go into. This report is not all doom and gloom. There are many good developments, as well as those that don't fit in well to their existing communities. However, let's remember that it does need to be a balance, and that the higher or medium density, higher spec and high amenity properties can end up completely unaffordable for most residents. Let's make sure that we don't go too far and have unintended consequences by making developments unaffordable for both developers and residents, and lose the higher density, vibrant and sustainable 21st century that we need altogether.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Look, and thanks for the debate. I think it's really good that we've managed to finally get to the bottom of one of these issues. But there was one other thing I wanted to say, and that is that if anyone thinks it's going to be easy and straightforward to change the district plan, I want you to not think that at all. We're in for a battle, because it's there are a lot of interests that will not want to see the priority focused on the neighbourhoods, but will want to see the priority focused on the profit that can be generated. That being said, there is profit to be had in developing well-designed, well-thought-through, sustainable developments that take into account the life cycle of the property itself and the people that will be living in it. People are building for a lot more than just their own family or their own personal circumstances. It's the next person that moves in after they move on. So I really do think that this is a good step for us to be taking today, and that this report, and I want to thank and acknowledge staff for the report, because what it has helped be is one of those catalysts for the kind of detailed analysis that we'll now have to do in order to get the plan change that the people of Christchurch want.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. I'm just going to adjourn the meeting for 5 minutes just so we can just do a bit of a change around at the back. So we'll restart at 11:30.